Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us. We're excited tonight to have Liuan Huska with us. She is a freelance writer and speaker focusing on topics of embodiment and spirituality. Her writing on everything from chronic pain to evangelical fertility trends appears in Christianity Today, The Christian Century, Sojourners, and she lives with her husband and their three little boys in the Chicago area. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Luann. Um,
Yeah.
I was flipping through the InterVarsity catalog. I don't know if it was like summer or fall of 2020, and I'm flipping, and then I come across your book on the right hand side of the page. I still remember what page it was on, the right hand side of the page, and it's your book cover, and like my heart stopped like when I
Uh,
read the title, and I was so excited. I got a little misty too, I have to say, because it was like I finally found a book that spoke to like where I was in my life right then, and
mhm,
immediately ordered a review copy,
mm,
and I have not been disappointed. And I've actually been reading
nice.
parts of it to my friends as well. Um,
Mm,
and In the first chapter, you wrote, if the healing work of Jesus applies to the whole of us, including our bodies, what does that mean when you're always hurting? Can my fragile, suffering body offer anything to my understanding of a meaningful life, or must I ignore it in order to go on? And later on, you wrote, perhaps what makes our suffering so intolerable is that shame and embarrassment keep us from expressing it. From calling up a friend and saying, I'm hurting, can you help me? In a wilderness of the body or emotions, we find ourselves alone, hemmed in by the walls of a self imposed independence. And your book reads like a friend calling up for help,
mm.
while giving others their permission to ask for help too. Tell us a little bit about yourself and why you wrote Hurting Yet Whole.
Hmm. Yeah. So I went to Wheaton College, graduated like I can't even remember. I'm not keeping track anymore. I think it was 12 years ago now. And so at that point, um, I had, just been a really high functioning, my body was always working for me, productive person. And thought that that was going to be the trajectory of my life is I have this agenda and then I'm gonna make it happen. And I had my idea of what surrender was, but people always say like don't ask God to, like don't really like ask God for that because he's gonna do really crazy things. And um yeah, so this definitely was not part of my life plan at all. But a year after I graduated from college, I started having pain in my ankle. And a few weeks or months later, I started getting depressed and anxious because the pain wasn't going away. And I felt like maybe I was doing something wrong, like that my body was wrong. And I had just all these questions because the way that I had related to God previously had been like, God, I can trust you because I know good things will happen in my life when I trust you. I mean, and that didn't necessarily mean like prosperity gospel type of good things, but just, um, just like I can kind of not be like flat on my back all the time. And so when I went through this first few months, it really felt like I was just grasping for who God was, like the God that I used to know just kind of like disappeared for me. And so that's what started out this whole journey of exploring what it means to live in a body that's hurting, what the gospel means, and if there's any connection between like my body that was constantly hurting and what Jesus says about being a healer and you know you know coming to us as a person, a human and fully divine as well. Yeah, so that's what started me on this journey. And I had several years where I was in pretty intense pain, where I couldn't walk more than a few blocks at a time, and had to adjust my definition of what normal was for me, and that kept changing. And my friends were, I was just out of college, so my friends were going backpacking and traveling to foreign countries and doing all these salsa dancing, doing all these fun things that I felt like I was just sidelined by the pain. Never got a diagnosis that really stuck. So in the end, it has gotten better, but it's just something that kind of flares up um, here and there. And so it's been something that I've had to reckon with, like, what does it mean when your body doesn't function the way you think it should? And what can we learn from that? Is, like you said when you read the quote from my book, is my body just something that I need to ignore in order to follow Jesus and live a whole or spiritually whole life, or is there something that our bodies can teach us, even when we're hurting?
Thank you.
Yeah.
In chapter 2, you refer to pain as a place. Being fully human is to inhabit the wild mysteries of our bodies and trust that because Christ was a body and still is a body, we don't need to fear this place. We can say it is good because Christ meets us here. But this is a complex, uncomfortable space to inhabit. It means we must live in the tension between our susceptibility to pain, disease, and suffering, and the truth of Jesus as healer and redeemer. Can you explain more about this tension between our susceptibility to pain and the truth of Jesus as our redeemer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you were mentioning that I refer to pain as a place, and so I think before I had chronic pain, I had sort of this map of what like the good life was, and also what um, kind of like what's good and bad, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there's um, like there's God created human beings like as perfect is what I like kind of thought of, and our bodies as perfect, and then sin entered the world, and now we have pain and disease and
Mm-hmm.
suffering and all these things. But then when I got, started having chronic pain myself, and then I wasn't able to kind of figure out, like, is this because of sin, or is
Mm-hmm.
this like just like the result of the fall, or is it something about me that I'm
Right.
doing wrong? And praying to God for healing, and I had this idea in my mind of what healing was, which was just getting rid of the pain so I could go back to normal, quote
Yeah.
unquote. And not having that happen, I really felt like I like fell off the map, that I had in my
Mm-hmm.
mind of like, okay, you like do these things and God meets you, even if it's not, maybe he doesn't like heal you physically, but at least like you feel God's presence, like, and you're able to go on. And there was
Yeah.
just some times when I didn't, and I kept seeking for some kind of like way forward, and felt like that wasn't being offered. So it really felt like a wilderness that I just kind of got like sidetracked in the
Mm-hmm.
weeds. But, I know now that that's a pretty common spiritual experience. And I could have told you that beforehand, but not until you go through it, you don't really know what it's like. There's people that like church fathers and mothers that have talked about the dark night of the soul,
Mm-hmm.
and the absence of God, when the only presence of God that we feel is God's absence. So those are some of the kind of the existential like things that I was feeling. And so in that spot, I had to ask, like, okay, is it true that Jesus is our healer? Is it true that like he wants to redeem my whole self? But then there's all these things about my body that aren't working the way I think they should, at least in my mind, the way I thought I was created. So I kept trying to like put these pieces together, and they didn't seem to fit together. Like my body didn't seem to fit with this message that Jesus was the healer. So that's where that tension came about, and also where I started reading some different interpretations of the Genesis story and the
Mm-hmm.
creation and the fall stories, where um, there are other interpretations besides the idea that pain and suffering and death entered the world. as a result of Adam and Eve's sin. There's interpretations that make room for the fact that maybe there was pain even before the fall, and maybe there's ways that our bodies have, there's been like bacteria and viruses in the natural world even before humans were there. So, what do we make of those things? So, all of that kind of helped me give me some different frameworks to understand what was going on in my body, that maybe my body wasn't wrong, that I didn't have to experience pain and then feel like there's something wrong with me, but maybe I could just be like, it is what it is. Like, my body is what my body is, and I can still trust that God loves my body and that God still has a purpose for me in my body without needing to fix my body to go back to some kind of like imagined perfection that I thought like my body was meant to be. If that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely it does.
Yeah.
Here is another quote from page 29 in your book. What do our bodies mean? What does our pain mean? What I've tried to show so far is that we often don't know. Being fully human is to inhabit the wild mysteries of our bodies and trust that because Christ was a body and still is a body, we don't need to fear this place. Did I already ask you that question?
Mm-mm.
No? Okay,
No.
good. Because I was like, oh no, it's about the place again.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wait, I did. Yes, I did ask you this question. So sorry. I must have put
No
it down there
worries.
twice. Okay.
You just
Went
really
on to the
wanted to ask
next
me that
one.
question.
It was a really good quote. Yes, I'd love to hear more about it. So you point out that our Western perception of a higher quality of life as an absence of disease is troublesome. You quote John Swinton, who says, healing always has first and foremost to do with connecting and reconnecting people to God. And I found that a really, really profound statement. And so I want to tell us more about that. What would that look like?
Yeah. So like I said, talked about earlier, we have these visions of what perfect or normal are, and they don't always come from the Bible. Like, the idea of what a perfect body is or what health is has changed throughout history, or what beauty is. If you just look back at the last 100 years and what like a beautiful female body looks like or whatever, the pictures are so different. So when we start to understand that, like what we think of as normal is, and what's like kind of like healthy is very often defined by like the cultural standards of the day or the medical standards of the day. And we've often let medicine kind of define the terms for us. So medicine defines health as the absence of disease, but that's a very like kind of a negative definition, right? It's about what's not there, but what is there to have health. And so I started to think about healing more as wholeness, and wholeness as being who you are, which is a definition I got from the educator Parker Palmer. And part of that also is, who are we and what are our bodies for? I think that our bodies were made for relationship, and we as human beings are made for relationship. So what does it mean to like have healing even when your body is hurting, and when you're in like chronic pain or chronic illness or terminal illness or just some kind of disability that's ongoing? I think if we think about it in terms of wholeness and being who you are, like we were made to be with other people. We were made for a connection. And so you can do that whether you are able-bodied or have all kinds of disabilities. You're still able to connect with other people, to like call out, like you said, call out a friend and say, I'm hurting. I really need you to help me, or ask for help and receive help or give help. And it might not even be in the ways that we imagine it to be. Like you can have nothing like that society deems as worthy to offer people, but you have your presence and you have
Mm-hmm.
like who you are as a human being. And I think that's enough to like offer to people in this kind of like give and take relationship. That's what makes human beings what they are, and what's modeled for us like in the incarnation and in the church, this type of vulnerable community. So yeah, that's what I think of, I guess, as healing is um, being honest about who we are, and then being able to be received as who we are in community. And I'm sure you guys experience some of that at Japuza in ways that most people living in suburban,
Mm-hmm.
life don't. Like intentional community is such a beautiful model of that, being together with people and like having your weaknesses be met by other people's strengths and vice versa.
Right, because it's not that we're all the healthy or all the unhealthy all the time. It's, some of us are healthy at some times, others are healthy at other times, and we're constantly sort of
Mhm.
like, um, I'm taking care of you now, and then later I'm sure you're going to have to take care of me at some point. Um, and and it's hard to go from that place of I'm afraid to ask for help, or I'm embarrassed, or I don't want to, put anyone out, to that feeling and belief that like since I am asking you to help me, like it's actually a blessing for us to help
Mhm.
one another. It's actually a blessing. Like when I let someone help me, I'm blessing them with
Mhm.
that request or that openness. And I tell my friends sometimes when they're feeling like, oh, I don't want to ask you this, or you're doing so much or whatever. It's always like, but this is blessing me. Like I am blessed by this opportunity and this privilege, to
Mhm.
meet your need right here when I can,
Yeah.
and don't deny me that blessing, right? Like don't
Yeah.
don't deny the body of Christ the blessing of like actually like speaking to where you're hurting, and where you need healing, and and I think it's important, like you said, in community to realize that, you do have so much to offer, whether you are laid up in your room. um, you're still present, right? And you have that gift of availability at times where you can
Mhm.
pray for people and you can, be present to those around you. Um, and so it is such, a table turning of like how we view disability or
Mhm.
unhealthiness and disease and that sort of thing. So thank you for speaking to that.
Yeah.
Um, and can you explain the hierarchy of rank relating to women, racial minorities, people with nonconforming sexual identities, and people with disabilities when it comes to receiving health care? Like, this was, I think, one of the most important chapters in the book.
Mhm.
And I'd love to hear you talk about this.
Mhm. Yeah. So, yeah, and I've been thinking about this more since I've written the book. I wrote a piece for CT in November about health insurance, and it's the first time I've ever really like taken a deep dive into the subject. And it was a steep learning curve, that's for sure. But I think we have this in the United States, we have this kind of assumption that whatever help you get, you should be like working to earn that help, even if you're like getting food stamps or healthcare, like you need to be working, like you need to show that you deserve that government aid. And so that comes to yeah, that also happens when we think about like our bodies, like okay, if you're able-bodied and you're not sick, then you can get this kind of insurance because like you qualify to like pay less money. But does that mean that the sick people have to pay more money for their insurance when they can't afford it because they're sick and they can't work? So it's just a really messed up system. Like if you start to think about it, like do we have to work to deserve care? Is the big question. And then as far as the hierarchy of rank, I think, in the again, like I just in this country, because of this history of racism and slavery, but also just a really long history of patriarchy too, of kind of seeing white heterosexual men um, as kind of like the epitome of a good human being or like a normal human being that makes everybody else kind of inferior, right? So if you're not a man, you're a woman, so that's kind of an inferiority. That puts you in a different category. Or you're not able-bodied, you can't work 40 hours a week, you can only work 20 hours a week. Well, that also puts you in a different category. So there's all these ways that we start to rank our bodies because they're different. Or yeah, you're not white, you're black, or you're Asian, or you're Latino, or whatever. According to this scale of these are better bodies and bodies that are more worth caring for, and these are bodies that are less worth caring for, maybe less than human if we, actually like we're honest about
Mm-hmm.
what that message is. And I think that comes through in so many ways from who we think deserves health care to just the people that we put on screens and on stage at conferences. Like you can see what bodies we value and what bodies we would rather keep on the side because they make us uncomfortable, and they don't fit our vision of what's normal and like healthy and successful and good. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yes. And you also wrote about how historically women, in their pain, in their ailments, in their complaints, have sort
Mm-hmm.
of systematically been dismissed. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I started doing the research on chronic illness, and I started by just asking people to share their stories with me, and almost everybody that I talked to was a woman. And I know part of that is because I'm a woman, so I was kind of attracting, like to like, but I I just saw this pattern of women have like being more vocal about their chronic illnesses and also just having more chronic illnesses. And I started looking at some of the numbers, and it turns out that 75% of autoimmune disease sufferers are women. And then there are also studies that show that women, um, live with more chronic pain or chronic illness. And some of that is because women are socialized to be more expressive of their pain, and men are socialized to kind of just tamp it down and say they're okay. But so I started kind of asking what was going on and why do women have more chronic illness, and chronic pain. Um, and in the book, I talk about how there's some of it's like our biology, like
Mm-hmm.
we have different hormones that kind of mediate our pain sensors, and that mediate how our bodies experience stress and what that does to our bodies. But also some of it is the way that society's built. So like I mentioned, like as we were just talking about with the previous question, society's built with men in mind. Like if you think about like some examples, like the office spaces, the temperature for like cooling an office space is calibrated to the body heat production of
That makes
men.
so much sense.
Yeah. So, women are always like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm cold in office spaces because
Mm-hmm.
it's calibrated to like a higher body heat production. Or like bathrooms, men and women have like the same bathroom space usually, like when buildings are designed, but women take longer to use the bathroom because we have periods and we just need more time in the bathroom and more space. But usually that's not taken into account. Or like medical research. Up until the 1990s, most medical research was done on men as like the default subject. So
Mm.
like a lot of things were missed about like how women experience certain prescription drugs and the side effects that came up because they didn't do the studies on women. I mean, there's just like so many examples of the way that our society is built with men as the default. And what I kind of concluded is that that is just like I think you can think about like living in a woman's body or living in a as a person of color or living in a disabled body, like in similar ways. Like we like go out into the world and things aren't made with us in mind. Like we have to accommodate to the spaces we're in instead of like receiving accommodations a lot of the time, and that's really stressful. And so that there's a strong connection between stress and chronic illness and pain. And so, yeah, that's some of what I talk about in that chapter on women and chronic illness. Like, why do women experience more chronic illness? Some of that's biology, but some of that is, yeah, just social structures.
Thank you. Yeah, and that temperature thing really hits right here for me. I'm always
Yeah.
the coolest one in the room.
Yes, me too.
Tish Harrison Warren has a new book out called Prayer in the Night, and she has a chapter on suffering where she writes, "Suffering does not merely happen to us, it works in us." And I've been reading through that book with a group of people at the same time that I was reading your book, and there were some parallels there with pain and suffering and affliction, and God's presence in it all. You speak to this as well in your beautifully titled chapter, The Craft of Suffering. You write that letting the suffering work in us is the more crucial task. And first, I'd like you to talk about what you mean by the craft of suffering. And also then, what does letting the suffering work in us as the more crucial task, like how has that worked for you and how can we let it work for us?
Yeah, the craft of suffering came from this. I was talking with a theologian. His name is Ephraim Radner. When I was working on an article about dying, the science of like anti-aging science, and he was just commenting to me that people don't know how to suffer these days. Like there's so many ways that we've kind of pushed suffering under the rug or made it so suffering is not like an everyday experience for most people, or at least most white middle class people, that we kind of forgot like what it means to suffer. And when it happens, the first thing we want to do is just like avoid it and try to do everything we can to numb the pain or escape it in some way, or just like explain it away and blame someone for it. So that's where that phrase comes from, the craft of suffering. And yeah, I think even though I'm not white, and I come from an undocumented immigrant family, so there was a lot of suffering or like just hardship in my growing up years. I definitely absorbed that narrative from like American society, that if you just work hard enough and you are smart and just have a lot of grit, then you can kind of make a really good life for yourself. So when I started having pain and I did everything and nothing made it go away, I was really angry, and I think I definitely had that experience of just wanting to make it go away, wanting to escape it, instead of letting it work on us, letting suffering shape me. And it took me a really long time to, like I write in my book, to like give myself over to the pain. And I guess what I mean by giving myself over to the pain, so I talk about my childbirth experience in the book as one of the ways that I learned to do that. Like in childbirth, you like treat the pain as almost like a friend. Like the pain is there because it's like something your body is going through, so that it can open up and have a baby. And so I remember like going to childbirth classes or getting these handouts that would say like make friends with the heavy feeling of release, like reframing pain as this heavy feeling of release. And it did help actually, because then I wasn't resisting it. Because my first child, I had my idea of what I wanted my childbirth to look like. But I also was like really afraid of losing control of my body. I wanted a natural childbirth, but then
Yes.
I like didn't want honestly, I didn't want to poop on the table. Like I was just so
Oh,
afraid of like
I was there too.
everything,
Yes.
yeah,
That was my number
everything
one
like
fear. Yeah.
yeah, falling out of me, that I was like holding in and like just clenching and bracing. And that was like the opposite of what you're supposed to do in childbirth, which is just to like melt and like let your body do whatever it needs to do. So once I was there's this point in childbirth, like I had been laboring for like several days, and finally the midwife came in and said we should do pitocin. Like you're not progressing, and you don't want to go through another night of labor. And that was a really hard turning point for me, because I had to let go of control, because I knew like the loss of control was going to happen whether I wanted it to or not. Like if I kept like clenching and not letting my body do what it was doing, then people were going to do things to me, like medical interventions. And
Yes.
I didn't want that either. So I did end up like when my husband and I and my mom were there and we started praying, and something shifted, and I was able to let the pain happen without being like fearful
Phew.
of it.
So
Bless
sorry.
you.
Excuse
No
me.
worries. Yeah, so when I did that, my body started doing what it needed to do, and I had the baby. And not to say that that's going to happen for every woman. There's like so many other factors that come into play. But for me, it was a lesson that, yeah, pain didn't have to be something that I was afraid of, but that resisting the pain actually made it worse and made my suffering worse, because I was um, constantly running away from it instead of like working with it and just being present with it. Yeah, so that's kind of what I mean by letting the pain work on us. And I know that like pain from chronic illness is really different than pain from childbirth. Like it's two very different things. And chronic illness pain is unending. Like you don't know what the result is, and it often gets worse or it goes up and down. But I think there's a way we can still approach it as something that can um, open up our hearts and open up our spirits to the work that God wants to do in us, the deliverance that God wants to bring about for us and for other people.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mhm.
Um, Let me see. I have to have another quote here from
Mhm.
you. Um, Let me see. Okay. In that same chapter, The Craft of Suffering,
Mhm.
you wrote that what I know is that suffering is inescapable in this life, and it is futile to try to avoid it. I also question whether it is helpful to try to find the meaning behind the suffering we endure, to try to figure out God's plan. Are we then trying to explain it away, mounting another form of resistance? I ask a lot of whys in my pain, but in the end, the more helpful questions start with how and who. How will I live now? Who is God for me now? Who am I becoming? I first want to ask you about the form of resistance, how the questions that we pose can actually be a form of resistance. So I'd like you to ask you that, and then how have these questions transformed your pain?
Mhm. Yeah. Um, yeah, I think the asking why question, um, it kind of puts it's a form of resistance, because it kind of puts the suffering at an arm's length. Like if I can understand it logically or rationally, like I did, this like I don't know, I was like ate unhealthy when I was younger, so now I have this problem or whatever, like whatever your suffering is, we always want to find like a cause for it.
Hmm.
Or on the other hand, we want to say, well, I don't know why it happened, but I know that God is going to do this through it. Like we
Right.
have some
Yes.
effect that we want to find from it. And both of those things, I think, are ways to kind of take control.
Hmm.
Because then if we like know why it happened or what's going to happen next, then it feels like we're safe, or that
Hmm.
like it's not like this wilderness place where we don't know like if it's going to get better or worse or what God's doing. And so I think when we're in that place of wanting to take control, that we're not in that place of like surrender and vulnerability, where we're just saying like, I know you're here and that's all I know, and that's
Hmm.
enough for me. And so I think that's what I mean by like the whys being a form of resistance, because it kind of allows you to kind of externalize your suffering or your pain instead of like just being there in it and
Hmm.
finding God in it, in the middle of it, without knowing what happened before or what's going to happen after. Um, and then you have to ask me the second part of your question
um,
again.
how has asking these questions transformed your own pain?
Hmm. Yeah, the how and the like,
Hmm.
how is this shaping me, or who is God for me? Yeah. So yeah, I think asking who am I becoming is one of the questions that I keep asking, because I guess in the beginning when I had pain and I started to realize I'm not going to be able to do all these things that I thought I was going to be able to do, like from like my backpacking plans, or like going to graduate school and just doing everything at this really fast pace. I did end up going to graduate school, but it looked really different than I had originally anticipated. And so that like I was constantly in this like doing and productivity framework, where that what my doing was kind of defining my worth. And I when I started asking like, who am I becoming in this, then the focus shifted less about what I was able to do or not do, because like so much of what I kind of was frustrated by was what I was not able to do. Then I was able to start like focusing on my being, like what is my like what are the postures that I am living out? Like, am I becoming a person that's open and generous, or am I becoming this person that's tight-fisted and
Hmm.
like rigid in my approach to the world? So that's been a really helpful question. And then the who is God for me question, like I think I've just come to understand God differently than I used to. And I guess I sometimes like you can't find God, and sometimes like it feels like there's just no solid ground to stand on. And I remember meeting with a woman from church that was praying with me, and I kept telling her, I feel like I'm hanging on by this thread, that I'm just like clawing my way to God and clinging to my faith. And like I think the thread is going to snap at any moment, and I don't know where I'm going to be. And I remember her saying like it's okay to let go of that thread. Like God is going to be there to catch you, or like God is at the bottom, like the pit where you thought like it couldn't get any worse. That's where God is. And so, I stopped. I mean, it's still like an ongoing process. It's
Yeah.
it's like these lessons you like revisit over and over. But I learned that like God is not something I have to attain, but God is like the ground beneath my feet, and the thing that's solid when everything else feels unsolid. And that might not be who I thought God was, but whatever it is that's sustaining me, I've come to understand that that's what God is. And when like pain can sometimes feel like it just obliterates you, and like you lose your sense of self. Um, and yeah, it just feels like you're just like wobbly and spiritually walking on wobbly knees. Yeah, God is that place where like you fall down and you're just in a puddle, and there's something that keeps you going the next day, and it's hard to define that. And it's less, you have less certainty in some ways, but I think that the certainty that you have is deeper because it comes from this place when like everything's been stripped away. Whatever that is that remains is that place where God is.
Yes. I was reading your book and, came across our mutual friend, Kimberly Pelletier, that you mentioned
Yeah.
in the book, who was my
Yeah.
spiritual director. And
Yeah.
Kimberly, if you're out there, we love you. You're an amazing woman.
Yeah.
But similar to what your questions are, we were in this like grueling process of spiritual direction. And at one point she was like, what do you think this is an invitation to? And like without hesitation, I'm just like misery. And but that question she asked
Yeah.
changed everything for me. It changed the complete, the direction. And that question, it changed me. Like it transformed me to where, like you said, when you're in those times when you are feeling desolate and you're feeling depressed and you're in so much pain, and you don't know the reason why, and you're tired of asking the question and not receiving an answer. What Kimberly taught me was, what is this an invitation to? And that's been sort of like my go-to question when I'm in those places. And in Henry Nouwen's book, Compassion, he talked about the difference between Eastern culture and Western culture as it pertains to health and death, and how, when there's a person in their family who is sick in, Eastern culture, whether it's now or, in ancient times, that person would be brought into their home with them. And when they died, their body would be in their home with them. They'd be preparing that body for burial. They'd be with that body until it is buried. And how in our Western culture, like when we see sickness, when we see disease, when we see death, like we put it outside, completely outside of our homes, right? And out of sight. And other people are there to take care of our loved ones. And with that, what steps can the body of Christ take, right? As people who are called to care, called to walk alongside those who are hurting. How can we better embrace, encourage, and love others with chronic illness inside and outside of the church today?
Yeah. Yeah, you're so right about that, putting it on the outside. And one of the things I talk about in my book is the need to center, like to bring the people whose bodies that we're scared of, that make us really uncomfortable, that just show us our mortality and our vulnerability and our humanity, but are kind of threatening, to put these people in the center, because like that's where Jesus puts them in the Gospels. Like he puts the sick and the hurting and the people that were marginalized in the center of his ministry. And he makes those people like the people that he calls to as disciples. And so I think we need to stop seeing hurting people as projects that we're working on. And we had talked earlier about like there's the kind of this divide that we live with between like the giver and the receiver and the helper and the one being helped. But like in the body of Christ, like we give and we receive at different times and in different ways, and it might not be seen as valuable or productive or worthwhile by society, but the people that are cast away by society have gifts to offer, or the people that whose bodies have been marginalized have gifts. So yeah, seeing people as bearing gifts, especially the people that are hurting, seeing them, Henry Nouwen mentions, he has a whole book called Wounded Healer, that it's out of like our wounds and our own pain that we can connect with other people at this like shared universal level. Like, I'm human, you're human, we both know pain, we both know suffering. Let's not push the pain away, but let's deepen the pain to a level where it can be shared, and then it can be like born together, so it's not as heavy. Like, we're not just individuals living in our, single family homes carrying our own pain. We're together in this. Yeah, so those are some ways, but also like just more practically, like I think we need to learn to listen without having an agenda, without offering advice. Like
Yes,
that's something
please.
that people
Yes.
always, when I talk to people with chronic illness or pain, they're always like, just don't, like, I've tried everything. Please don't tell me one more thing that I need to do. Um, yeah, and it's really hard because again, pain and suffering make us uncomfortable. So we want to fix it. We want to do something so it's kind of contained and outside, so it doesn't like spill over to us, because that's, I think, the concern a lot of times. But if we can learn to just be with people in pain without needing to tell them what to do next or fix it, I think like good things can happen out of that. And I can't like tell you that it'll be some formula that you can't build like a exponentially growing ministry on that, but you will build relationships, and that's where the kingdom of God can be found, in those kinds of relationships.
Great. Thank you, Luann. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for being here. Thank you for sharing your hurts as well as your lessons that you've learned and the wisdom that you've gained from your own personal journey with chronic pain and illness.
Thanks for
Yeah,
having
I'm
me.
so thankful that we could be here tonight with you.
Yeah.
And yeah, blessings on your next endeavor. Hopefully, it won't
Thank
be 10 years until we get to see something out of you. So,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you all for being here tonight. And in May, we're going to have Tish Harrison Warren here,
Yay.
interviewing her about her new book, Prayer in the Night. So, thank you all for coming, and good night.